The listening post at Relay Station Keth-04 was the loneliest place in the galaxy, and Overseer Teal liked it that way. He was Villani, an insectoid creature with 4 arms and compound eyes that could read 12 data streams at once, and he had spent the last 40 years of his life sitting in this cold metal room at the edge of known space, watching numbers scroll across his screens and cataloging every whisper the universe made. Nothing ever happened at Keth-04, and that was exactly how the Galactic Concord wanted it. The Concord was a union of over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations that had maintained peace for 12,000 years through careful diplomacy and an almost religious commitment to avoiding conflict. And in all that time, the greatest excitement Teal had ever experienced was the detection of a rogue comet that turned out to be a lost cargo hauler from the Drelkathi trade lanes. So when his gravity sensors screamed at him on what should have been an ordinary night cycle, Teal almost fell out of his chair. He scrambled across the console with all 4 arms, pulling up the raw data feed from the deep space array, and what he saw made his antennae flatten against his skull in confusion. There was a gravity signature in Sector 117 null. That alone was strange because Sector 117 null was empty, a dead zone of cold dust and ancient radiation where no civilization had ever emerged, and no probe had ever found anything worth reporting. But the signature itself was what made Teal's blood run cold. It was massive. His instruments told him it was roughly the size of a small moon, and his first thought was that a rogue planetoid had drifted into sensor range, which would have been mildly interesting and worth a note in his weekly log, but nothing more. Then the signature moved. Teal stared at his screen and ran the calculation again because he was certain he had made an error, but the numbers came back the same, and then the signature moved again, and this time it was faster, and Teal realized with a sick dropping sensation in his stomach that this was not a planetoid. This was a vessel. Something the size of a small moon was flying through Sector 117 null with purpose and direction, and it was heading toward the boundary of the Ashen Veil. Teal knew about the Ashen Veil the way everyone in the galaxy knew about it, which was to say he knew the official version and nothing more. The Ashen Veil was a wall of hyperspace storms that stretched across an entire region of the galaxy like a curtain made of broken physics, and nothing that went into it ever came back out, and the Concord's official position for the last 10,000 years had been simple and final. Nothing of concern exists beyond the veil. But there were older stories, stories that predated the Concord itself, whispered among the archivists and intelligence analysts who spent their lives digging through ancient records. Stories about a species that lived behind the storms. The records were fragmentary and incomplete, scattered across dead languages and extinct databases, but they all said roughly the same thing. Something lived in there, something loud, something that fought and built and refused to die no matter what the universe threw at it. And the ancient civilizations that had first mapped the Ashen Veil had made a collective decision to leave it alone. Teal had always dismissed those stories as myth because the Ashen Veil was impenetrable, and whatever lived behind it was trapped there, and that was the end of it. Except now something was moving on the other side, and it was heading for the exit. He sent a priority alert to the Concord Intelligence Bureau, and then he sent another one to the High Forum on Ethes Prime, which was the diplomatic heart of the Concord, where thousands of species gathered to argue about trade routes and border disputes, and all the small, comfortable problems of a galaxy that had forgotten what real danger felt like. The responses came back within hours, and they were exactly what Teal expected. The Intelligence Bureau thanked him for his diligence, and told him they would monitor the situation, which was bureaucratic language for, "We will file this and forget about it." The High Forum did not respond at all. Teal sat in his chair and watched the gravity signature continue to move, and he felt something he had not felt in 40 years of quiet service at the edge of nothing. He felt afraid. He was an archivist by training and by nature, which meant he understood something that politicians and diplomats often did not, which was that the universe did not care about your comfortable assumptions, and the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. And just because something had been sealed away for 10,000 years did not mean it would stay sealed forever. He pulled up every fragmentary record he could find about the Ashen Veil and the sealed region beyond it, and he read them all again with new eyes. One record in particular caught his attention. It was old, older than the Concord itself, written in a language that had been dead for 8,000 years by a species that no longer existed, and it had been flagged in the archive as unverified cultural mythology, which was the academic way of saying nobody took it seriously. The record was a warning, and it said this: "Do not open the Ashen Veil and do not attempt to make contact with what lives beyond it, for the species that dwells behind the storms is not like us. They are born of a world that tried to kill them every day of their existence, and they survived not through wisdom or patience, but through a stubbornness that borders on madness. They do not know how to stop fighting, and they build their tools of war the way we build our temples, with love and pride and an artist's eye for destruction." Teal read the warning 3 times, and then he looked back at his gravity sensor and watched the impossible signature accelerate toward the boundary of the Ashen Veil. Over the next several days, the signature grew closer, and Teal tracked it with the obsessive focus of someone who knows they are watching history unfold, even if no one else believes them yet. He sent more reports, and they were acknowledged and filed and ignored. He contacted colleagues at other listening posts, and they told him he was probably looking at a sensor ghost or a gravitational anomaly caused by the Ashen Veil storm patterns, and he should recalibrate his equipment and get some rest. He did not recalibrate his equipment, and he did not rest. On the 7th day, the signature reached the inner boundary of the Ashen Veil, the place where the hyperspace storms were thickest and most violent, the place where every probe ever sent had been torn apart like paper in a hurricane. The signature did not slow down. It did not stop. It did not turn around. It hit the storm wall and pushed through it like a fist through wet cloth, and Teal watched his instruments scream as the Ashen Veil's outer boundary ruptured for the first time in recorded galactic history, and something enormous and impossible and very, very real came through to the other side. His console erupted with alerts from every sensor in the array, and the gravity readings were so far beyond normal parameters that his computer simply displayed an error code it had never been programmed to show, because no one had ever imagined a scenario where it would be needed. Teal sat perfectly still in his chair. His 4 hands trembled against the console. The galaxy had been quiet for 12,000 years, and everyone had believed that the quiet would last forever, because they had built their peace on the assumption that nothing existed that could break it. They were wrong. Something had come out of the Ashen Veil, and it was heading toward open galactic space, and it was larger than anything any living civilization had ever built, and it moved with the confidence of a creature that had never once in its entire existence considered the possibility that it might lose. Teal opened a new transmission to the High Forum, and this time he marked it with the highest priority code the Concord had, a code that had not been used in 6,000 years, and he wrote a single line. "The veil is broken, and something is coming through, and I do not think it is going to stop." For the first time in 12,000 years, the quiet galaxy held its breath. Fleet Commander Ashan of the Drelkathi Navy had never seen his crew afraid before, and he did not like how it felt to watch it happen. He was standing on the bridge of his flagship, the Gentle Current, a sleek and elegant warship that was considered one of the finest vessels in the Concord patrol fleet, and around him, his 60 ships held formation in a defensive arc above the agricultural world of Paleith Roman 4. And every single one of his officers was staring at their screens in total silence. The thing that had come through the Ashen Veil was here. It had crossed the distance between the Veil and the Paleith system in 3 days, which should have been impossible because that distance would have taken a standard conquered vessel 2 weeks at maximum hyperspace velocity, and it had arrived not with the cautious drift of a lost traveler, but with the steady, unhurried pace of something that knew exactly where it was going. Ashan had ordered long-range scans the moment it entered the system, and the results had broken his sensor arrays twice before his engineers managed to get a stable reading on the 3rd attempt. And when the numbers finally came through, his bridge went so quiet he could hear the hum of the air recyclers. The vessel was 74 kilometers long. Ashan read the number and then he read it again, and then he asked his sensor officer to confirm it, and his sensor officer confirmed it, and then asked permission to sit down because his legs had stopped working. 74 kilometers of metal and armor and weapons systems that the Conquered's databases could not identify, layered in hull materials that absorbed and scattered scanning frequencies so effectively that even at close range, the ship was a half-ghost on their instruments, radiating heat like a dying star, its mass so enormous that it was already beginning to shift the tidal patterns of Paleith Roman IV's oceans just by being nearby. It was not a ship in any sense that Ashan understood the word. It was a mountain with engines. Ashan had served in the Conquered Navy for 30 years, and he had trained for every scenario the military academy had imagined, and he had studied the tactical doctrines of 100 different species, and none of it had prepared him for this, because none of it had ever considered the possibility that a single ship could be larger than most space stations. His communications officer reported that the Galnet was overloading with traffic as every intelligence agency and science council and military command in the galaxy accessed the shared sensor feed from Paleith and watched through borrowed eyes. Trillions of beings across 4,000 civilizations were watching his 60 ships float in front of this impossible thing, and Ashan was suddenly very aware that whatever he did in the next few minutes would be remembered for a very long time. He did what his training told him to do. He opened a hailing channel on all standard frequencies and transmitted the Conquered's formal first contact greeting, which was a carefully worded message of peace and welcome that had been designed by linguists and diplomats over centuries to be as unthreatening as possible. There was no response. He transmitted it again. Silence. He transmitted it a 3rd time and added his own name and rank and the name of his vessel, and the fact that Paleith was a peaceful agricultural system with 12 million civilian inhabitants, and that the Conquered wished only to communicate. Silence. And then after what felt like an eternity, but was actually 4 minutes and 11 seconds, the vessel spoke. The transmission came on a single unencrypted frequency in crude but functional Conquered Common, the shared trade language of the galaxy, and it said this: "This is the Terran Union Navy vessel Prometheus Unbound, TCS Titan class. We come representing the human species. We wish to talk." Ashan stared at the words on his screen. His second-in-command, a young Drelkathi officer named Vane, leaned over and whispered, "What is a human?" Nobody on the bridge had an answer. Ashan forwarded the transmission to Conquered Intelligence, and within minutes, the entire apparatus of galactic knowledge was searching for any reference to a species called humans from a political entity called the Terran Union, and what they found was almost nothing. There were fragments scattered across pre-conquered archives, scraps of data from civilizations that no longer existed, and they painted a picture that was incomplete and unsettling. A bipedal species from a high-gravity world with a toxic atmosphere and extreme weather patterns that had somehow developed intelligence, and then technology, and then spaceflight, all while living on a planet that seemed to be actively trying to kill them at all times. The records classified their homeworld as a Category 12 death world, which was a designation that most xenobiologists considered theoretical because no species was supposed to be able to evolve to sapience on a world that hostile. And yet here they were. And they had built a ship 74 kilometers long and punched through the Ashen Veil and crossed half a galaxy in 3 days, and now they wanted to talk. Ashan watched his screen and tried to decide what to do, and while he was deciding, something happened that changed everything. A small craft detached from the belly of the Titan-class vessel. It was tiny, absurdly tiny, a little shuttle that was barely visible against the impossibly vast hull of its parent ship, and it began moving toward the conquered patrol fleet at a gentle, non-threatening velocity with its weapons systems powered down and its shields inactive. It was broadcasting a single repeating message. Diplomatic shuttle requesting permission to approach, single passenger aboard, no weapons, we just want to talk. Ashan's tactical officer urged him to deny the approach and maintain distance, and call for reinforcements, because they did not know what they were dealing with, and the risk was too great. Ashan looked at the little shuttle floating toward them against the backdrop of the largest warship anyone had ever built, and he made a decision that historians would later describe as either the bravest or the most foolish act of his career. He granted permission to dock. The shuttle landed in the Gentle Current's main hangar bay 20 minutes later, and Ashan went down to meet it personally with an honor guard of 12 soldiers who were trying very hard not to let their weapons shake in their hands. The shuttle door opened, and a single figure stepped out. She was small. That was the first thing Ashan noticed, because he had expected something massive and terrifying to match the massive and terrifying ship she had come from. But instead she was small and soft-skinned, and walked on 2 legs with a gait that suggested her species had evolved to cover long distances on foot. She had dark skin and gray-streaked hair pulled back from her face, and she wore a simple uniform with no visible weapons, and she looked at Ashan and his 12 armed soldiers with an expression that he could not read at first but later realized was calm. Not the calm of someone who was not afraid, but the calm of someone who had made peace with fear a long time ago. She introduced herself as Captain Ravas Singh of the Terran Union Diplomatic Corps, and she said she carried the full authority of the Terran Union to negotiate on behalf of the human species, and she apologized for the dramatic entrance, and explained that the Prometheus Unbound was the only vessel they had that could survive the crossing through the Ashen Veil. Ashan looked at her and then looked past her at the shuttle, and then thought about the 74-kilometer warship sitting outside his window, and he asked the only question that seemed to matter. Why did you come in the largest warship your species has ever built if you only wanted to talk? Captain Singh smiled, and it was a small, tired smile that carried the weight of centuries behind it, and she said, "Because we spent 800 years trying to get through the Ashen Veil, and we had no idea what was waiting on the other side, and my people have a saying that it is better to have strength and not need it than to need strength and not have it. We did not come to threaten anyone, Commander. We came because we were curious and we were afraid, and we built the best ship we could because that is what humans do when they are afraid. They build something strong, and then they go and look." Ashan stared at her for a long time, and then he did something that surprised even himself. He lowered his weapon and extended his hand in the gesture of welcome that his people reserved for honored guests, and he said, "Then welcome to the galaxy, Captain Singh. You have a great deal of explaining to do." She laughed, and it was a warm sound that did not match the cold metal warship she had arrived in, and she said, "I know, where do I start?" Behind them through the viewport, the Prometheus Unbound hung in the darkness of space like a sleeping giant, patient and silent and vast. And across the galaxy, 4,000 civilizations watched and whispered, and wondered what this strange, small, soft-skinned species wanted, and why they had brought a mountain to a conversation. The High Forum on Ethais Prime was the largest diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy. A cathedral of polished stone and living crystal that could seat representatives from every member species of the conquered, and in 12,000 years of galactic civilization, it had never once been completely full. It was full now. Every seat was taken, and every corridor was packed, and every balcony was crowded with bodies of every shape and size and color, because word had spread across the galaxy at the speed of light that the creature from behind the ashen veil was coming to speak, and no one in the history of the conquered had ever wanted to miss anything this badly. Captain Rivas Singh walked into the chamber escorted by a security detail of conquered soldiers who towered over her by a full meter on each side, and she looked up at the vast domed ceiling and the thousands of alien faces staring down at her, and she did not flinch. She was 53 years old, and she had spent 30 of those years in the Terran Union Diplomatic Corps, preparing for a moment that most people in her government believed would never actually come, because the Ashen Veil had been considered impassable for so long that the idea of crossing it had become almost mythological. A dream that old scientists talked about over drinks, but nobody seriously expected to happen in their lifetime. And then the engineers at the Helios shipyard had built the Prometheus Unbound and proven everyone wrong, and suddenly, Rivas Singh was the most important person in the history of her species. She walked to the speaker's platform at the center of the forum, a raised circle of white stone where every voice was amplified to reach every corner of the chamber, and she stood there alone under the gaze of the galaxy, and she began to speak. She spoke in conquered common because her linguists had spent the 3-day journey from the Ashen Veil learning the language from intercepted broadcasts, and she spoke it imperfectly but clearly, and she began not with demands or threats but with a story. She told them about Earth. She told them about a world with crushing gravity and a poisonous atmosphere that had slowly become breathable over billions of years. A world of earthquakes and hurricanes and volcanic eruptions and ice ages. A world where the ocean was full of things that wanted to eat you, and the land was full of things that wanted to crush you, and the sky regularly caught fire. She told them about a species that had started as small, frightened animals hiding in the shadows of larger predators, and had somehow, through sheer stubborn refusal to die, climbed to the top of the food chain, not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they were the most persistent. Because when the universe knocked them down, they got back up. And when it knocked them down again, they got back up again, and they kept getting back up until the universe ran out of ways to knock them down. She told them about the wars and the plagues and the famines and the catastrophes that had marked human history like scars on skin, and she did not hide from it or soften it. She told them that humans had nearly destroyed themselves more than once because the same stubborn fire that kept them alive also made them dangerous to each other. And then she told them about the Ashen Veil. She told them that when humans finally reached the stars and discovered the wall of storms that surrounded their region of space, their first reaction was not to accept it as a boundary, but to start looking for a way through, because that was what humans did with walls. They went through them or over them or around them, but they never ever simply accepted them. It had taken 800 years of research and engineering and failure and death before they built a ship that could survive the crossing. And the reason that ship was so impossibly large and so impossibly powerful was not because humans wanted to intimidate anyone, but because the Ashen Veil was the most violent natural phenomenon any of their scientists had ever studied, and anything smaller would have been torn apart. We built the Prometheus to survive the storms, she said. We built it because we had to, not because we wanted to frighten you. And I understand that it is frightening, and I am sorry for that, but I will not apologize for my people's desire to reach beyond the walls that confine them, because that desire is the most human thing about us. She paused and looked around the chamber at the thousands of faces watching her, insectoid and reptilian and gaseous and crystalline, and every other form that life had found a way to take in this vast and ancient galaxy, and she continued. We come to offer trade and partnership and cultural exchange. We come to offer mutual defense treaties and scientific cooperation. We come as neighbors who have lived behind a wall for too long and want to finally meet the people on the other side." The chamber was silent for 3 full seconds, which was an eternity in a room full of thousands of politicians, and then it exploded into noise. Factions formed instantly the way they always did, when something disrupted the comfortable order of galactic politics. The welcoming bloc saw opportunity, new trade routes and new technology, and a powerful new ally in a galaxy that was not as safe as it pretended to be. The isolationists saw only danger, a predator species from a death world that had somehow built the most powerful weapon in existence, and was now standing in their house smiling at them. The fearful saw a threat display, a species that brought a world killer to a peace talk, because it wanted everyone to understand exactly what would happen if the peace talk failed. The debate raged for hours, and through it all Singh stood on the platform with the patience of someone who had expected this reaction, and was prepared to wait it out. It was Ambassador Qwal of the Tesserae who finally cut through the noise. The Tesserae were an ancient reptilian species with the second largest military fleet in the galaxy, and Qwal was their senior representative, a massive scaled figure with golden eyes and a voice like grinding stone. And when he spoke, the chamber went quiet because the Tesserae were old and powerful, and everyone listened when they talked. Qwal descended from his balcony to the forum floor and walked to within 3 meters of Singh, and he was easily twice her height and 4 times her mass, and he looked down at her and said, "You bring a world killer to a peace talk. What message does that send?" Singh looked up at him, and she did not step back, and she did not lower her eyes, and she said, "The same message a locked door sends, that we have survived everything that has ever tried to kill us and we intend to keep surviving. The Prometheus is not a threat, Ambassador. It is a promise. Hurt us, and we will still be here when you are done." The chamber went completely silent. Qwal stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his golden eyes, something that might have been respect or might have been recognition, the look of a predator meeting another predator, and understanding that this one was not prey. He turned and walked back to his balcony without another word. The debate continued, but the energy in the room had changed because Singh had done something that no amount of diplomatic language could accomplish. She had told the truth, simply and directly and without apology, and the truth had weight that even the oldest civilizations in the galaxy could feel. Over the following days, the forum argued and negotiated and formed committees and subcommittees, and the diplomatic machinery of the conquered ground forward in the slow, careful way it always did. But something else was happening in the background, something that only the intelligence analysts and archivists noticed. Deep in the Concord's classified archives, buried under layers of security clearance and forgotten passwords, an ancient file was unsealed for the first time in 8,000 years. It had been placed there by a species that no longer existed, a species that had been among the first to map the Ashen Veil and had chosen to seal the region rather than attempt contact. And the file contained a single document written in a language that only the Villani archivists could still translate. Overseer Teal was the one who translated it because the Intelligence Bureau had finally started taking his reports seriously, and the document said this: "We have studied the beings behind the storms for as long as we dared, and we have decided to seal the passage and destroy our records and pray that they never find a way through. Not because they are evil, they are not evil, but because they are something worse than evil. They are relentless. They do not stop. They do not give up. They do not accept defeat. When they are broken, they rebuild, and when they are pushed, they push back harder. They do not know how to stop fighting, and we fear that if they ever reach the wider galaxy, they will change it in ways that cannot be undone." Teal read the warning, and then he looked at the live feed from the forum where Captain Rivas Singh stood small and calm and unbreakable on the white stone platform. And he thought that the ancient species had been right about everything except the most important part. They had assumed that a species that did not know how to stop fighting could only be a threat. They had not considered the possibility that it might also be a gift. While the galaxy argued about humanity, something old and hungry was already moving. The Dreechan hegemony existed at the edges of the Conquered's maps, a vast and patient empire of silicon-based warforms that had been expanding for longer than most living civilizations had existed. And they did not negotiate, and they did not trade, and they did not make friends, because they did not need to. They consumed. That was the only word that accurately described what the Dreechan did. They arrived at a world and they stripped it bare, eating the biomass and the minerals and the atmosphere itself, converting everything into fuel and raw material for more warforms, and then they moved on to the next world and did it again. The Conquered had known about the Dreechan for over 1,000 years, and their strategy for dealing with them had been the same from the very beginning. Give ground slowly, cede the outer rim territories one system at a time, maintain the appearance of peace, and hope that the Dreechan would eventually run out of things to consume before they reached the core worlds. It was a strategy born of fear, and everyone who understood the numbers knew it was failing. The Dreechan were not slowing down, and they were not running out of resources, and the territory they had consumed in the last century alone was larger than some entire civilizations. And the Conquered's military analysts had quietly calculated that, at the current rate of expansion, the hegemony would reach the first major population centers within 200 years. 200 years seemed like a long time to most politicians, so they filed the reports and continued with their comfortable lives, and told themselves that someone else would solve the problem later. But the Dreechan were not politicians, and they did not think in terms of later. They thought in terms of efficiency and advantage and threat assessment. And when the Prometheus Unbound's gravity signature rippled across their sensor networks, they did something they had not done in centuries. They paid attention. The Dreechan Collective processed the data with the cold mathematical precision that governed everything they did, and they reached a conclusion that was perfectly logical and completely terrifying. The Titan-class warship represented a strategic threat, a single vessel powerful enough to potentially disrupt their expansion, and if it were integrated into the Conquered's defensive infrastructure, it could shift the balance of power in ways that would cost the hegemony centuries of progress. The solution was simple: destroy it now before the opportunity was lost. A warswarm was assembled. 40,000 Dreechan warforms pulled together from across the outer rim like a fist closing, each one a semi-autonomous killing machine ranging in size from small fighters to massive carrier-class organisms, and they moved toward the Paleith system with the unstoppable momentum of a glacier made of teeth. They did not announce themselves, because the Dreechan did not believe in warnings. Fleet Commander Ashan was the first to detect them. His sensor officer reported the incoming signatures during what should have been a routine watch cycle, and at first the numbers seemed like an error because no fleet in the galaxy had ever been that large. But the numbers kept climbing, and when they finally stabilized at 40,000 contacts, Ashan felt something crack inside his chest that he realized was his ability to pretend that everything was going to be fine. He sent distress calls to every Conquered military installation within range, and the responses came back quickly, and they were all the same. Help was coming, but it was weeks away because the Conquered's main battle fleets were spread across the galaxy, and consolidating them took time. Ashan did not have time. The Dreechan would reach Paleith in less than 2 days, and his 60 ships were the only thing standing between them and 12 million Drelkathi civilians who had never seen a war, and did not even have shelters to hide in, because no one had ever imagined that war would come to a quiet farming world in the middle of Conquered space. He began evacuating as many civilians as possible, but there were too many and too few transport ships, and the math was brutal and simple. Most of them would still be on the surface when the Dreechan arrived. The news reached Ethais Prime within hours, and the high forum erupted into chaos. Species that had been arguing about whether to welcome humanity were suddenly screaming at each other about military response times and evacuation protocols, and the 1,000 other details that mattered desperately when death was 2 days away. Captain Singh was in her temporary quarters on Ethais Prime when the intelligence briefing reached her, and she sat on the edge of her bed and read the report twice, and then she was very still for a long time. Her aide, a young lieutenant named Marcos Chen, watched her and said nothing because he had served under Singh for 8 years, and he knew what her silence meant. It meant she was making a decision that would change everything. She stood up and walked to the communications terminal in her quarters, and she opened a direct quantum link channel to the Prometheus Unbound, which was still sitting in the Paleith system, surrounded by Ashan's patrol fleet like a mountain surrounded by birds. The channel connected, and the face of Admiral Yuki Tanaka appeared on the screen. Tanaka was 61 years old with short silver hair and dark eyes that missed nothing, and she had commanded the Prometheus Unbound since it launched from the Helios shipyard 9 years ago, and she had spent every day of those 9 years keeping 12,000 crew members alive aboard a ship that was essentially a city-sized weapon, flying through space. Singh looked at her and Tanaka looked back, and an entire conversation happened in the silence between them, because they had known each other for 20 years, and they did not need words to understand what was coming. Singh said 2 words, "Wake up." Tanaka nodded once and the screen went dark. Aboard the Prometheus Unbound, Admiral Tanaka walked from her private quarters to the bridge, a vast command center buried deep in the heart of the ship, where 200 officers managed the systems that kept the Titan operational. And she stood at the central command platform and looked out at her crew, and she spoke. "All hands, this is Admiral Tanaka. I am ordering the ship to full combat readiness effective immediately. A hostile force of approximately 40,000 warforms is inbound to the Paleith system with the intention of destroying everything in it. There are 12 million civilians on the surface of Paleith Roman 4 and 60 conquered patrol ships that will not survive first contact with this enemy." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice was steady and clear, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. "We did not cross the Ashen Veil and travel halfway across the galaxy to watch people die. The Terran Union Navy does not stand by while innocents are slaughtered. I do not care that these are not our people, and I do not care that this is not our war because it is our war now. Every war where someone cannot fight for themselves is our war. That is what the uniform means." She looked at the faces of her crew, 12,000 men and women who had volunteered for a mission that everyone told them was impossible, who had left behind families and homes and everything comfortable to fly a 74-kilometer warship through a wall of storms into the unknown. "Battle stations," she said, "all weapon systems to full power, all shield generators online, all fighter wings prepare for launch. We are going to put ourselves between that swarm and those civilians, and we are going to hold the line until there is nothing left to hold it with." The bridge exploded into motion as officers raced to their stations, and the great ship began to wake from its quiet slumber. Deep in the engineering sections, reactor cores that had been running at minimal power surged to full output, and the ship hummed with an energy that could be felt in the bones. Weapons systems that had been dormant since the crossing through the Ashen Veil powered up one by one. Graviton lances and cascade, torpedo batteries and point defense arrays, and the main kinetic accelerator that ran the entire length of the ship like a spine made of electromagnetic fury. Fighter bays opened along the hull and hundreds of strike craft began their launch sequences. The shield generators came online and wrapped the ship in layers of protective energy that made the surrounding space shimmer like heat haze. Across the galaxy, every sensor network detected what was happening, and the readings were so extreme that several automated monitoring stations flagged them as instrument malfunctions, because the energy output of a single vessel was not supposed to look like a star igniting. On Ethais Prime, the delegates of the High Forum watched the sensor feeds in stunned silence as the Prometheus Unbound transformed from a sleeping giant into something else entirely, something that radiated power and purpose and a cold, clear promise of violence. Ambassador Quwall of the Tesserae watched from his balcony, and for the first time in his long and decorated career, he felt the scales on the back of his neck rise in an involuntary threat response that his species had not needed in 10,000 years. Captain Singh stood in the forum chamber and watched the same feeds, and her face showed nothing, but her hands were clenched at her sides, and Lieutenant Chen saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer or might have been a promise. On the bridge of the Gentle Current Fleet Commander, Ashan watched the Titan-class warship come alive, and he felt two emotions at the same time that he would have thought were incompatible. He felt terror at what this ship was capable of, and he felt hope for the first time since the Drechon signatures had appeared on his sensors. The Prometheus Unbound turned toward the incoming swarm and began to accelerate, and the stars behind it blurred as it moved, and it was heading directly into the path of 40,000 warforms, with nothing beside it but 60 small patrol ships, and the desperate faith that sometimes one mountain is enough. The Drechon warswarm arrived at Paleith like a black tide rolling across the stars, 40,000 warforms moving in the locust cloud formation that had devoured civilizations and stripped worlds bare, and never once been stopped by anything the galaxy had thrown at it. Fleet Commander Ashan's 60 patrol ships formed a desperate defensive line above Paleith Roman 4, their weapons charged and their shields raised, and their crews silently making peace with the knowledge that they were about to die for the 12 million civilians on the planet below. And then the Prometheus Unbound moved between them and the swarm. It moved with a speed that should have been impossible for something its size, crossing the distance in minutes, and it positioned itself directly in the path of the incoming Drechon like a wall of metal and fury. And Admiral Tanaka's voice came through on an open channel that every ship in the system could hear. Conquered vessels, fall back to defensive positions around Paleith Roman 4 and protect the civilian population. The Terran Union Navy will handle the swarm. Ashan stared at his screen, and his tactical officer said what everyone on the bridge was thinking. She cannot be serious. It is one ship against 40,000. Ashan looked at the Titan-class warship hanging in the void between his fleet and annihilation, and he remembered the look in Captain Singh's eyes when she had stepped off that little shuttle, the calm of someone who had made peace with fear, and he gave the order to fall back. The Drechon swarm did not slow down or adjust their formation, because they had analyzed the Titan-class vessel and determined that no single ship, regardless of size, could withstand a concentrated assault from 40,000 warforms, and the mathematics of the situation supported their conclusion. The mathematics were wrong. The Prometheus Unbound fired first. Its graviton lances reached out across the void like fingers of twisted light, and where they touched the Drechon warforms they did something that the galaxy had never seen before. They folded space around the targets and crushed them, not with energy or heat, but with gravity itself. Warforms the size of cruisers crumpled like paper being squeezed in a fist, and the leading edge of the swarm simply ceased to exist in a line of silent implosions. The swarm reacted instantly because the Drechon collective did not experience shock or hesitation. They simply recalculated and adapted, and the formation split into dozens of attack groups that came at the Titan from every direction at once. The ship's point defense network activated, and it was like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Thousands of small rapid-fire weapons creating overlapping fields of destruction so dense that the space around the Prometheus became a solid wall of light. Warforms that tried to close the distance were shredded before they could get within weapons range, their fragments tumbling away in clouds of debris. Cascade torpedoes launched from batteries along the hull in salvos of hundreds, each one programmed to detonate in sequence, so that the explosion of one triggered the explosion of the next, creating chain reactions that ripped through swarm clusters like fire through dry grass. A single salvo could destroy 1,000 warforms in seconds. The Dreechan adjusted again and sent their heaviest warforms forward, massive carrier-class organisms with armor thick enough to survive the point defense fire, and they pushed through the wall of light and began hammering the Titan's hull with everything they had. The Prometheus Unbound took hits. Thousands of them. Sections of the hull glowed white-hot as Dreechan weapons poured energy into the ship's armor, and in places the armor cracked and atmosphere vented into space in white plumes that froze instantly into crystals of ice. Damage reports flooded Admiral Tanaka's bridge, hull breaches on decks 40 through 60, fire suppression systems active in the port weapons bay, shield generators 7 through 12 operating at reduced capacity, casualty reports from forward sections. Tanaka stood at her command platform, and she did not flinch. Damage control teams to all affected sections. She said, reroute power from non-essential systems to shields, and charge the main gun. The main gun. The Prometheus Unbound's primary weapon was a kinetic accelerator that ran the entire 74-kilometer length of the ship, an electromagnetic rail system capable of accelerating a tungsten slug to 6/10 the speed of light. And when the engineering teams reported that it was fully charged, the bridge crew felt the ship vibrate around them like a living thing drawing a breath before a scream. Tanaka identified the Dreechan command nexus, the central coordination node that linked the entire swarm's collective intelligence, a massive organism buried in the heart of the formation. Fire, she said. The ship fired. The tungsten slug left the accelerator at 180,000 kilometers per second, and it crossed the distance to the command nexus in a fraction of a heartbeat, and it hit with the force of a small nuclear detonation. And it did not stop. It punched clean through the nexus and kept going, tearing through the warforms behind it in a straight line of total destruction that extended for thousands of kilometers before the slug finally left the swarm and vanished into empty space. The command nexus disintegrated, and the effect on the swarm was immediate and devastating. Warforms that had been moving with perfect coordination suddenly faltered as their connection to the collective intelligence was severed. They did not shut down because each one had basic autonomous programming, but they lost the strategic awareness that made them dangerous as a group, and the swarm went from a single coordinated army to 40,000 individual units acting on instinct. The Prometheus Unbound pressed forward into the disorganized swarm, and it was no longer defending, it was hunting, its weapons firing in continuous salvos that tore through the confused warforms with mechanical precision. 47 minutes after the first shot was fired, it was over. The Dreechan warswarm was reduced to a field of drifting wreckage that stretched across millions of kilometers, fragments of silicon and metal tumbling in the silence of space. And in the center of the debris field, the Prometheus Unbound sat battered and burned in bleeding atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches. Its hull was scarred and blackened in places, and sections of its superstructure had been torn away entirely, and it looked like it had been through a furnace. And it was the most beautiful thing Fleet Commander Ashan had ever seen. A transmission came through on all frequencies, Admiral Tanaka's voice, steady and calm as if she were reporting the weather. Paleith system is secure. Terran Union Navy standing by to assist with search and rescue. We have medical facilities available for any conquered personnel who need them. Across the galaxy, trillions of beings watched the replay of the battle, and they saw something that changed the way they understood the universe. They saw a single ship do in 47 minutes what the entire galactic conquered could not do in 1,000 years. The aftermath unfolded quickly in the way that great events always do, like a dam breaking and releasing a flood that had been building for ages. The Concord's isolationist faction collapsed overnight, because it is very difficult to argue that a species should be locked behind a wall when that species just saved 12 million of your citizens from extinction. Ambassador Quall of the Tesserae did something that stunned the entire galaxy. He personally traveled to the Prometheus Unbound and boarded the battered warship, and stood on its scarred bridge, and presented Admiral Tanaka with the Tesserae Star of Valor, the highest military honor his species possessed, an award that had not been given to a non-Tesserae in 9,000 years. Tanaka accepted it with a bow and said simply, "We did what anyone would have done," and Quall looked at her with his ancient golden eyes and said, "No, Captain, you did what no one else could have done. That is not the same thing." The Drechon hegemony sent a diplomatic envoy for the first time in their existence, not to the conquered, but to the humans, because the Drechon understood only one language, and the humans had just spoken it fluently. The conquered High Forum convened a special session and voted unanimously to offer the Terran Union full membership in the Galactic Concord, a process that normally took decades of negotiation compressed into a single day by the weight of what had happened at Paleith. Captain Ravas Singh stood on the white stone platform where she had first addressed the galaxy, and she accepted the invitation, and she gave a short speech that was broadcast to every inhabited world in the Concord. "We built the Prometheus because we were afraid," she said. "We crossed the Ashenvale because we were curious. We fought today because people were going to die and we could stop it. That is all humanity has ever been, afraid and curious and unwilling to look away when someone needs help. We are not perfect, and we are not always wise, but we do not abandon people, and we do not surrender, and we do not ever stop trying to do better. You have called us monsters, and you are not wrong. We are the monsters that the monsters are afraid of, but we choose who we fight for, and today, and every day after, we choose to fight for you." The chamber erupted in a sound that had no name, thousands of species expressing something that went beyond applause or approval. It was relief, the deep shaking relief of someone who has been carrying a weight they could not bear alone and has finally found someone willing to help carry it. In the weeks that followed, human engineers helped repair the damage to the Paleith system, and human doctors treated conquered soldiers who had been wounded in the initial panic, and human diplomats sat down with representatives from hundreds of species and began the long, slow work of building relationships that would last for generations. The Prometheus Unbound was repaired at the Concord's largest shipyard, and when the Concord engineers got their first close look at the ship's internal systems, they sent back reports that were equal parts admiration and horror, because the humans had built things into that ship that no other species would have even considered: redundant systems on top of redundant systems, manual overrides for every automated process, damage control stations on every deck, medical bays large enough to serve as hospitals, and a crew trained to fight and repair and keep fighting even when the ship was falling apart around them. It was a ship built by a species that expected to be hurt and had decided in advance that being hurt was not a good enough reason to stop. Far away at Relay Station Keth 04, Overseer Teal sat at his console and opened the ancient warning file that had started everything, the file that said, "They do not know how to stop fighting," and he read it one more time, and then he added a personal note at the bottom, something that he felt the original authors would have wanted to know. Addendum: "They do not know how to stop fighting, but they choose who they fight for. That makes all the difference." He saved the file and closed his terminal and looked out the viewport at the stars. The galaxy was not quiet anymore. For the first time in 12,000 years, it did not need to be.